Okay, it's honestly wild how fast people learn to look away when violence comes with a badge. Two people are dead, shot, real bodies, real families, real consequence. One of them was a veteran's ICU nurse, and somehow the first reaction isn't a grief of or outrage. It's excuse, accounting, strangers online rushing to justify something they weren't even there to witness. You can hear the language kick in immediately. Procedures, context, split-second decisions, clean, bureaucratic words used to sanitize something that ends with a human being on the ground. And before the victim even gets dignity, the person who pulled the trigger gets the benefit of the doubt. What really disgusts me is how quiet it gets. Not agreement, worse than that, silence. The kind that lets responsibility evaporate. I've seen people get angrier over a bad video game update than this situation. That's how optional empathy has become. This is how it starts, not with chaos, but with comfort. I'm not making this video to make about winning an argument or something like that. It's about making it harder for a system to lie comfortably. Because lies don't survive well when they're forced to share space with facts. They need people to move on before the seams start showing. So instead of doing that, we're going to slow everything down and look directly at what's being presented as a normal. Not the press statements, the sequence. We need to talk about the sequence themselves. Early January, during a federal immigration operation, Renée is killed, a civilian, a mother, someone who had people depending on her, people whose lives didn't stop when hers did. The official story locks in almost immediately, justified, threat perceived, procedure followed. The language is efficient, clinical, and final. The case is emotionally closed before most people even know who she was. Weeks go by, then January 24th, Minneapolis, Alex Pretti is shot and killed by federal agents. Different day, different operation, and same result. A civilian is dead. And before a complete investigation even exists, the defense of the shooters is already fully formed. The talking points are out, the tone is confident, the conclusion is implied. This isn't presented as a tragedy, it's presented as a resolved administrative outcome. If you chart this out, it starts to look less like chaos and more like choreography. Minutes before the shooting, there is danger. Seconds after, force is used. Minutes later, statements are issued. Hours later, the narrative hardens. And at no point is there space for genuine uncertainty. No pause that something irreversible just happened. The system moves forward immediately. Like something is stopping these questions it doesn't want to answer. That speed matters. Now let's talk about Alex as a person, because systems, your government like this rely on abstraction to function. Alex Pretti wasn't a headline or a label. He was a veteran's ICU nurse. That wasn't a side detail. That was his life. His work involved long hours, constant pressure, and responsibility for people who were already carrying the physical and psychological damage of serving this country. His job was literally to keep people alive. That was his contribution to the public good. And now he's dead, killed by federal agents representing the same government he served in a different capacity. A veteran ICU nurse killed by his own government. That sentence alone shouldn't sound normal, and yet it's already being treated like it is. What happens next is the most revealing part, not the shooting, but the response. Or more accurately, the pattern. There is no trial, no completed investigation, no transparent accounting of events available to the public. Instead, we're given a sentence, we're expected to accept as sufficient. The agents failed treated or something like that. It replaces evidence with emotion. It transforms fear into justification. It asks the public to accept that perception alone is enough as long as the person with the weapon represents the state. This is where the system shows its hand. Scroll through public relations and you see the logic kick in almost automatically. People start reverse engineering guilt, he must have done something, they wouldn't shoot for no reason, there has to be more to the story, and blah 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 and so on. That's the point. Maybe, that's only a maybe. But notice the asymmetry. The state gets unlimited patience, civilians get suspicion by default. Authority is assumed rational, victims are assumed as risky individuals and so on. And questioning that imbalance is treated not as civic responsibility, but as hostility. When you compare the official claims to what's actually available, video fragments, witness accounts, timelines, the story doesn't clarify, it just destabilizes it. There are missing seconds, conflicting descriptions, moments that don't align cleanly, and instead of addressing those gaps with evidence, your country is just fills them with confidence, trust us, we investigate ourselves, we decided, and so on. That's not transparency. That's just some institutional insulation. And every time someone asks a basic question about procedure, about escalation, about alternatives, the response, it's an information, it's just defensiveness, it's tone, it's the suggestion that scrutiny itself is dangerous, that asking question is somehow, more threatening than killing civilians. Then comes the next phase, narrative control. This is the part that almost feel procedural. The victim starts getting reframed, all details are resurfaced, new implications appear, words like unstable, erratic, concerning, not charged, not findings, just enough ambiguity to make empathy feels irresponsible. Just enough distance to make people comfortable again. This is the second killing, okay, I'm telling you. First the body, then the name. Once the person is abstracted enough, the violence becomes easier to accept. Once their life is reduced to a risk profile, the conversation shifts from accountability to justifications. I believe that it's necessary for the system to protect itself. Renée becomes a footnote, Alex becomes a problem, and the structure that produced both of them remains untouched, the system that makes both of them dead. Okay, this is not about a single incident or a single operation or something like that. This is about the system, your country that prioritizes authority over truth and speed over accountability. A system that close ranks faster than it opens records. A system that treats civilians' death as a public relation challenge instead of moral failures. The response from Trump administration makes this impossible to ignore. There is no call for restraint, no insistence on waiting for facts, no visible discomfort with the idea that civilians were killed, just immediate alignment with force, immediate justification, because within the framework, loyalty to authority is non-negotiable. Truth is optional. Accountability is conditional for them. People like to imagine dystopia thing as something obvious, like Cyberpunk 2077, things got loud, militarized, theatrical, but real dystopia is administrative, it's procedural. It's made of statements, protocols, and people being told to move on. It looks exactly like the United States right now. A mother killed and reduced to a statistic, a nurse killed and reframed as a threat, questions treated as a tax, silence just got rewarded. And the most disturbing part is just how easily people adapt, how quickly outrage becomes optional, how empathy becomes conditional, how we start grading death instead of grieving them. That's how systems like this survive, not through fear alone, but through normalization, through people deciding it's safer to stay quiet than to stay engaged, through the slow erosion of the idea that power should ever have to explain itself. This is how it starts, not with chaos, but with acceptance, procedure, and with people telling themselves it's none of their business until one day it is. There's been a quote that's been stuck in my head all week from Karl Stochka, an Auschwitz survivor, once said it wasn't Hitler or Himmler who deported him, beat him, and shot his family. It was the shoemaker, the milkman, the neighbor, ordinary people who put on a uniform and decided obedience felt better than thinking. That's the warning, not about the uniforms themselves or some current versions of evil, but about how fast responsibility gets outsourced, how quickly people stop asking questions once authority hands them a script, once violence comes wrapped in a paperwork, pages, and press statements, suddenly no one feels involved anymore. History doesn't announce itself, it clears its roots, it waits for people to look away, and every time civilians die and we rush to excuse it, that road gets a little smoother. So I'll leave you with this. When the state kills and questioning it feels uncomfortable, who exactly are we trying to protect? Okay, I think that's my ranting for today. Thank you for watching. See you guys in the next video, hopefully on a much more better situation. Okay, stay safe and be careful out there. See you guys in the next video. Bye bye.